The fluorescent lights in room 7 had been flickering for 3 days, and Sarah Chen had stopped trying to explain it to maintenance. She'd worked the ICU at San Diego Naval Medical Center for 11 years, long enough to know when something felt wrong in her bones. The patient in room 7 had no name, no records, no family, just a bracelet that read John Doe and a vitals monitor that shouldn't have been possible. His heart rate held steady at exactly 60 beats per minute, not approximately 60, not ranging between 58 and 62, exactly 60, for 72 hours straight. When her supervisor ordered her to take a break, Sarah refused. When the shift change came, she told her replacement she was staying. And when the 2 men in dark suits flashed their Navy intelligence badges and told her to step outside, she planted her feet beside the bed and said the words that would change everything. "Not until someone tells me who he really is." That's when the taller officer's eyes locked onto the patient's exposed shoulder, where an impossible tattoo was slowly becoming visible beneath skin that had been blank hours before, a tattoo that showed classified submarine schematics from a vessel that wouldn't be built for another 6 years. Sarah Chen had seen death walk into her ICU more times than she could count, but she'd never seen it confused. The man in room 7 had arrived during the graveyard shift on a Tuesday, wheeled in by paramedics who couldn't answer a single question about him. No wallet, no identification, no phone. He'd been found unconscious on the beach near Point Loma, wearing clothes that looked simultaneously brand new and weathered by decades of salt water. The fabric was strange too. Sarah had touched the sleeve of his jacket before they'd cut it off him, and it felt like no material she'd ever encountered, slick and rough at the same time, with a faint iridescence that vanished when she looked directly at it. Dr. Reeves had examined him that first night, running through the standard protocol for unknown patients. Temperature normal, blood pressure normal, oxygen saturation perfect. Everything was normal, except that the blood work came back so clean it looked falsified. No alcohol, no drugs, no abnormalities whatsoever. His cells looked like they belonged to a 25-year-old Olympic athlete, but the weathering on his hands suggested someone in their 40s. When Sarah mentioned this discrepancy, Dr. Reeves had shrugged it off. "Maybe he has good genes," he'd said, but his eyes hadn't met hers. The first truly strange thing Sarah noticed was the heart rate. She'd been checking it obsessively, the way she did with all her critical patients, and after 6 hours she realized it hadn't varied by a single beat. She thought the monitor was malfunctioning, so she'd checked it manually, her fingers pressed against the warm skin of his wrist. 60 beats per minute. She tried again an hour later. 60 beats per minute. At 3 a.m., she'd stood beside his bed with her stopwatch, counting for 5 full minutes. 300 beats, exactly. Sarah had documented it in her notes, flagged it for Dr. Reeves, and expected some kind of response. Instead, her notes had disappeared from the system. When she'd asked about it, the day shift supervisor had told her she must have forgotten to save them. But Sarah never forgot to save her notes. That was when she started keeping a handwritten log in her pocket, old school, the way her first mentor had taught her. By day 2, she'd noticed the temperature. The room was cold, not ICU cold, but genuinely frigid, as if someone had cranked the air conditioning to Arctic levels. Sarah had requested maintenance check the thermostat 3 times, but every technician who came by said the system was reading normal. Yet Sarah's breath misted in the air when she spoke, and she'd started wearing 2 layers under her scrubs. The other nurses avoided room 7 now, claiming they had other patients who needed attention. But Sarah saw the way they looked at the closed door when they passed. They felt it too. The patient himself remained unconscious but stable, his chest rising and falling with mechanical precision. Sarah found herself studying his face during the quiet hours. He had the kind of features that were hard to place. He could have been from anywhere, with olive skin that might have been Mediterranean or Middle Eastern or Latin American. There was a small scar above his left eyebrow, perfectly straight, like someone had drawn a line with a ruler. His hands bore calluses in unusual places, Not the kind you got from manual labor or sports, but specific, deliberate marks that suggested repeated contact with something particular. On the third day, Sarah came in for her shift and found 2 additional monitors had been installed in room 7 overnight. Nobody had mentioned it in the handoff report. These weren't standard medical equipment either. They looked military grade, with displays showing readings she didn't recognize. When she'd asked the outgoing nurse about them, the woman had just shaken her head and said, "I was told not to touch them." That's when Sarah knew she wasn't dealing with an ordinary patient. She'd worked at a naval hospital long enough to recognize when something had been classified. The signs were there. The disappearing documentation, the avoid and deflect responses from her supervisors, the way certain people suddenly had urgent business elsewhere when she asked questions. But she'd also taken an oath, and that oath didn't have exceptions for classified patients. If this man was under her care, she was responsible for him, clearance level be damned. She'd just finished checking his vitals when she noticed his hand had moved. Not much, just a slight curl of the fingers, barely perceptible. But it was the first voluntary movement he'd made since admission. Sarah leaned closer, watching for any other signs of consciousness. His eyelids flickered, rapid eye movement visible beneath the closed lids. She was reaching for the call button when the alarms should have sounded but didn't. His heart rate had jumped, she could see it on the monitor, climbing from 60 to 90 beats per minute, but the alarm remained silent. Someone had disabled it. Sarah's instincts screamed at her. She checked the IV lines, confirmed the medication dosages, scanned every piece of equipment in the room. Everything appeared normal, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something crucial. That's when her supervisor appeared in the doorway. Dr. Patricia Huang, a woman who normally exuded calm competence, but now looked decidedly uncomfortable. "Sarah, I need you to take your break now," Dr. Huang said, her voice carefully neutral. "I just got here 20 minutes ago," Sarah replied, not moving from her position beside the bed. "Nevertheless, take your break. That's an order." Sarah looked at her supervisor, really looked at her, and saw something she'd never seen before in Dr. Huang's eyes. Fear, not concern, not stress, genuine fear. And that fear wasn't directed at the patient. It was directed at whoever had given Dr. Huang her orders. "I'm staying," Sarah said quietly. "This patient needs continuity of care, and I'm not leaving him until—" "Sarah," Dr. Huang's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "Please, just this once. Don't be the hero. Go take your break." Before Sarah could respond, 2 men appeared behind Dr. Huang. They wore dark suits that marked them as obviously as if they'd had "Federal Agent" tattooed on their foreheads. The taller one, with steel gray hair and a face that had forgotten how to smile, held up a leather wallet, displaying credentials that Sarah barely had time to read before he snapped it shut. "Ma'am, we need you to step outside," he said. It wasn't a request. Sarah's hands gripped the bed rail. She'd faced down angry family members, dealt with violent patients, stood her ground against doctors who thought nurses were there to follow orders without question. She wasn't about to let 2 suits intimidate her out of doing her job. "Not until someone tells me who he really is," she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "I'm responsible for this patient's care, and I can't do that if I don't know what I'm dealing with." The 2 men exchanged a glance. The shorter one, younger with nervous hands, started to say something, but the gray-haired man held up a hand to silence him. Then he looked at Sarah with an expression that might have been respect or might have been pity. "You don't have the clearance for that information," he said. "Then get me the clearance or get out of my ICU," Sarah shot back. That's when the gray-haired officer's gaze shifted from Sarah to the patient, and his entire demeanor changed. His face went pale, and his hand moved unconsciously toward the weapon Sarah could now see holstered beneath his jacket. He took a step closer to the bed, his eyes locked on the patient's exposed shoulder, visible where the hospital gown had shifted during the night. "Jesus Christ," he breathed. "When did that appear?" Sarah turned to look at what had captured his attention. The patient's shoulder had been unmarked when she'd checked him an hour ago, she would have sworn to it. But now, there on the skin, dark and crisp as if freshly inked, was a tattoo. Not just any tattoo. Sarah didn't have security clearance, didn't have military training, but she'd seen enough sailors come through this hospital to recognize technical schematics when she saw them. This was a blueprint, intricate and detailed, showing what looked like the interior layout of a submarine. And at the bottom, in precise lettering, were numbers and letters that seemed to glow faintly in the fluorescent light. SSN 808, followed by a date that made Sarah's blood run cold. 2031. Commander James Morrison had been with Naval Intelligence for 17 years, and in that time, he'd investigated everything from routine security breaches to potential foreign espionage. He'd interrogated Russian spies, tracked Chinese hackers, and once spent 3 months embedded with a group suspected of selling classified information to the highest bidder. Nothing in his career had prepared him for the impossible thing he was currently staring at on the shoulder of an unconscious man in room 7. The SSN 808 didn't exist. It wouldn't exist for another 6 years, when the Columbia-class ballistic missile submarine program reached its 3rd production vessel. Morrison knew this because he'd sat in on the planning meetings. He'd reviewed the designs himself, signed off on security protocols for the engineering team. The schematics tattooed on this man's shoulder matched those designs down to the smallest detail designs that were currently locked in a vault, requiring 3 separate security clearances to access. But this wasn't just a security breach. The date beneath the schematic was what made Morrison's hands shake as he reached for his phone. The tattoo showed modifications that hadn't been designed yet, improvements to the reactor cooling system that were scheduled for discussion in a classified meeting next month. "Nobody touches him," Morrison said, his voice cutting through the shocked silence in the room. "This entire floor is now under quarantine. Get everyone out except essential personnel." He turned to his partner, Lieutenant Chen, no relation to the nurse, though that was a coincidence Morrison would later find unsettling. "I need a secure line to SubCom immediately, and get someone from NCIS down here now." The ICU nurse, Sarah Chen, hadn't moved. She was staring at the tattoo with the kind of focused intensity Morrison recognized from good intelligence analysts. "That wasn't there 2 hours ago," she said. "I checked his skin when I was adjusting his gown. There was nothing." Morrison wanted to tell her she was mistaken, that she'd simply missed it, but the certainty in her voice stopped him. "You're absolutely sure?" "I've been a nurse for 11 years, Commander. I know how to perform a skin assessment." His shoulder was completely unmarked at 0600 hours. It's now 0815. That tattoo appeared in the last 2 hours. "That's impossible," Lieutenant Chen said. But he was already photographing the tattoo from multiple angles, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. "Everything about this is impossible," Morrison replied. He looked at the nurse again, really looked at her this time. She had the kind of face that inspired trust, open and honest, with dark eyes that missed nothing. More importantly, she'd been willing to stand up to federal agents to protect her patient. That kind of integrity was rare. "What's your clearance level?" "I don't have one. I'm a civilian contractor." Morrison made a decision that would either save his career or end it. "As of right now, you're working for me. Lieutenant, get her a temporary clearance. Confidential level should suffice." He turned back to Sarah. "You're not to leave this room or speak to anyone about what you've seen here. That includes your supervisors, your colleagues, and your family. Do you understand?" Sarah's jaw tightened. "I understand the order. I don't understand what's happening." "Join the club," Morrison muttered. He pulled out his phone and stepped toward the window, keeping his voice low as he made the first of what would be many phone calls that morning. Behind him, he could hear Lieutenant Chen running through standard security protocols, closing the blinds, posting guards at the door. But Morrison's attention kept returning to the patient, whose heart rate monitor continued its steady, impossible rhythm. The call connected, "This is Morrison. I need to speak to Admiral Kershaw immediately." "Yes, I know what time it is. Tell him it's about Project Hourglass. He'll want to take this call." The silence on the other end told Morrison everything he needed to know. Project Hourglass was so classified that even mentioning it should have gotten him arrested. But if what he suspected was true, protocol had already gone out the window. When Admiral Kershaw's voice came through the line, sharp with barely contained alarm, Morrison knew his instincts had been correct. "Report," the Admiral said. "No pleasantries, no questions, just that one word, heavy with dread. Sir, we have a situation at San Diego Naval Medical. Unidentified patient, unconscious for 3 days. He just manifested a tattoo showing detailed schematics of SSN 808, including modifications that haven't been approved yet." The silence stretched so long Morrison thought the connection had dropped. Finally, Kershaw spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Manifested? You mean appeared?" "Spontaneously appeared on previously unmarked skin, sir, confirmed by medical staff. The tattoo shows technical details that match classified documents from last month's review. And sir, there's a date, 2031. Morrison heard what sounded like a glass shattering on the other end of the line. When Kershaw spoke again, his voice had changed, taking on the cold, clipped tone of a man making battlefield decisions. "Lock down that entire wing. I'm scrambling a containment team from Coronado. They'll be there in 20 minutes. Nobody goes in or out until they arrive. And Morrison, I need you to check something for me." "Sir?" "Look at the patient's left wrist. Tell me if you see anything unusual." Morrison crossed to the bed, aware of Sarah Chen watching him with those sharp, observant eyes. He gently lifted the patient's left hand, turning it to examine the wrist. For a moment, he saw nothing unusual. Then, as he tilted the arm toward the light, he saw it, a faint marking, almost invisible against the skin, in the exact spot where a watch would sit. Numbers, counting down. As he watched, they changed from 72 hours, 14 minutes and 33 seconds to 72 hours, 14 minutes and 32 seconds. "There's a countdown," Morrison said into the phone. "Approximately 72 hours remaining." The Admiral's voice went flat. "Then it's already started. God help us all." Before Morrison could ask what had started, the patient's eyes opened. They were the wrong color, not brown or blue or green, but a shifting gray that seemed to capture and reflect the fluorescent light, like mother of pearl. The patient's lips moved, forming words in a language Morrison didn't recognize. The heart rate monitor, which had held steady at 60 beats per minute for 3 days, suddenly spiked to 120. Sarah Chen was already moving, checking the IV, adjusting the bed angle, her hands steady despite the impossibility of what she was witnessing. "He's trying to communicate," she said. "Commander, I need you to step back and let me work." But Morrison couldn't move. He was transfixed by the patient's eyes, which had now locked onto his own. And in that moment, Morrison felt something he'd never experienced in 17 years of intelligence work. Absolute, bone-deep certainty that he was looking at someone who shouldn't exist. Not someone who was classified, not someone who was undercover, but someone who literally should not be possible in this timeline, this reality, this version of the world. The patient's mouth moved again, and this time Morrison understood the words, even though they were in English with an accent he couldn't place. "You have to let me die. If you save me, millions die instead." Sarah's head snapped up. What did he say? Morrison was saved from answering by the arrival of Dr. Reeves, who burst through the door with 2 security guards in tow. "Commander, I'm going to have to ask you to explain why my ICU is being locked down by armed personnel. Dr. Reeves, this is now a matter of national security. You'll get your explanations when Admiral Kershaw arrives." Morrison turned back to the patient, but the gray eyes had closed again, and the heart rate was dropping back toward that impossible steady rhythm. 60 beats per minute. Exactly. Sarah was examining the countdown on the patient's wrist now, her fingers hovering just above the skin without touching. "It's not a tattoo," she said. "It's under the skin, subcutaneous, but it's not ink. I don't know what it is. It looks digital, but that's not possible." "Nothing about this is possible," Lieutenant Chen said. He'd finished securing the room and now stood with his weapon drawn, though Morrison couldn't imagine who or what he thought he might need to shoot. "Sir, we should evacuate the patient to a secure facility." Morrison shook his head. "Not until we know what we're dealing with. Moving him could trigger something." He looked at Sarah. "Tell me everything you've observed since he was admitted. Every detail, no matter how small or strange." Sarah glanced at Dr. Reeves, who gave her a slight nod. Then she pulled out a small notebook from her scrub pocket, the pages covered in neat handwriting. "I've been keeping notes because the digital records keep disappearing. The patient arrived 72 hours ago with no identification. His vital signs have been perfectly stable, too stable. Heart rate hasn't varied by a single beat. Temperature is normal, but the room temperature has been dropping steadily. I've documented it at 3-hour intervals. Currently, it's 54 degrees Fahrenheit in here, though the thermostat reads 72. Morrison felt the temperature now that she'd mentioned it. The room was indeed freezing. His breath misted in the air. "Has anyone else noticed this?" "Everyone who enters comments on it, but maintenance says there's nothing wrong with the system." Sarah flipped a page. "There's also the matter of his cellular aging. The preliminary blood work suggests he's in his mid-20s, but his hands show wear patterns consistent with someone 20 years older." Doctor Reeves ordered additional tests, but those results also disappeared from the system. "I never ordered additional tests," Dr. Reeves interjected. "I was told to minimize invasive procedures until his next of kin could be located." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "But you told me yourself that you wanted a full metabolic panel and genetic screening." "I said no such thing." Morrison held up a hand. "Let's assume you're both remembering correctly. Is it possible someone impersonated Dr. Reeves?" The doctor's face went pale. "In theory, yes, but that would require someone with access to hospital protocols and my credentials." The implications hung heavy in the air. This wasn't just about a mysterious patient anymore. Someone had been actively manipulating the situation, feeding false orders, erasing records. Morrison's mind raced through the possibilities. Foreign intelligence, corporate espionage, or something else entirely, something connected to Project Hourglass in ways he didn't yet understand. The patient's eyes opened again, and this time when he spoke, his voice was stronger, clearer. "Commander Morrison, Lieutenant Chen, Doctor Sarah Chen." He said each name with perfect precision, and Morrison's blood ran cold. "Yes, I know who you are. I know because I've been here before. This conversation, this moment, it's already happened, and in every iteration, it ends the same way." "What do you mean, every iteration?" Sarah asked, her clinical detachment cracking to reveal genuine fear. The patient tried to sit up, but his body wouldn't cooperate. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and the countdown on his wrist ticked down another second. 72 hours, 11 minutes, and 47 seconds. "My name is Dr. Marcus Webb. In your timeline, I'm currently 9 years old, living in Portland, Oregon. In my timeline, I'm 43 years old, and I'm the chief engineer on the SSN 808. I came back to stop something that hasn't happened yet. But the temporal displacement is killing me, and when I die, the information dies with me." Morrison's training screamed at him that this was insane, that time travel was science fiction, that the man was clearly delusional. But the tattoo on his shoulder was real. The countdown on his wrist was real, and the schematics matched classified documents with perfect accuracy. "What are you trying to stop?" Webb's eyes locked onto Morrison's. "In 72 hours, a device will be activated at the Naval Submarine Base in Kings Bay, Georgia. It's disguised as a routine reactor test, but it's actually a quantum temporal anchor. When it activates, it will create a causality loop that traps this timeline in a 72-hour cycle. Everyone will relive the same 3 days forever, and no one will remember except those who were inside the temporal field when it activated. He coughed, and blood flecked his lips. I've lived through this loop 47 times. This is my last chance to break it. The containment team arrived in unmarked vehicles exactly 18 minutes after Morrison's call to Admiral Kershaw. They came wearing hazmat suits, carrying equipment that Sarah recognized from disaster response protocols, except this equipment was unlike anything she'd seen before. The devices hummed with a frequency that made her teeth ache, and the readouts showed measurements in units she didn't recognize. The team leader, a woman who introduced herself only as Dr. Vance, set up a perimeter around room 7 that looked less like medical containment and more like something from a science fiction film. "Clear the floor," Dr. Vance ordered, her voice muffled through the hazmat suit. "Everyone except Commander Morrison, the patient, and," she consulted a tablet, "Nurse Sarah Chen. Everyone else needs to be at least 50 meters away." "What exactly are we containing?" Dr. Reeves demanded, but 2 members of the containment team were already escorting him toward the elevator, their grip firm but polite. Within minutes, the entire ICU floor had been evacuated except for the 3 people Dr. Vance had specified. Sarah noticed that Lieutenant Chen had been removed as well, despite his protests about security protocols. Once the floor was clear, Dr. Vance removed her helmet, revealing sharp features and eyes that had seen too much. "The temporal radiation readings are off the scale," she said without preamble. "Whatever brought him here created a wake in space-time that's still propagating. In layman's terms, he's leaking time." "That's not possible," Sarah said automatically, then felt foolish. Nothing about the last 72 hours had been possible. Dr. Vance gave her a look that might have been sympathy. "Nurse Chen, you're about to receive the briefing that will either make you the most valuable asset in this operation or get you disappeared to a black site for the rest of your life. Commander Morrison, does she have clearance?" "I authorized temporary confidential clearance," Morrison said, his jaw tight. "That's not nearly high enough for what I'm about to tell you, but we're past the point of protocol. Doctor." Vance pulled up a chair and sat down, the casual gesture somehow making everything more frightening. In 2019, DARPA initiated Project Hourglass, a theoretical research program into quantum temporal mechanics. The project was shut down in 2021 after a catastrophic accident at the Los Alamos research facility. Or at least, that's what the official record states. In reality, the project continued under deep black classification. We made a breakthrough in 2023. We successfully sent a single electron backward in time by 3 nanoseconds. Sarah's mind reeled. "You're telling me the government has functional time travel?" "Had," Dr. Vance corrected. Past tense. The facility was destroyed in what was officially reported as a gas explosion in August 2024. All research was supposedly lost. "Except someone, somewhere, continued the work. And they didn't just send electrons back in time, they sent a human being." She gestured toward the patient, toward Marcus Webb, whose gray eyes were tracking the conversation with painful awareness. "The question is who, and what are they trying to prevent or cause?" Webb's voice was barely a whisper now. "It wasn't the government, it was me. I built the device in my timeline, cobbled together from scrapped components and stolen research. It was the only way to break the loop." Morrison leaned forward. "Explain the loop, from the beginning." Webb closed his eyes, and for a moment Sarah thought he'd lost consciousness. Then he began to speak, his words coming in short bursts between labored breaths. "In my timeline, the quantum temporal anchor activated on the 5th of February 2026 at Kings Bay. The device was supposed to be a reactor safety system, a way to reset core conditions to a stable state in case of emergency. But someone modified it. Instead of resetting the reactor, it reset causality itself. Everything within a 50-mile radius became locked in a 72-hour temporal loop. "But we're not in a loop," Sarah protested. "We remember everything that happened before this patient arrived." "Not yet," Webb said. "The loop hasn't started yet. It starts in 72 hours. But here's what you don't understand about temporal mechanics. Once the loop begins, it has always been happening. From the perspective of anyone outside the loop, it will appear that Kings Bay and everyone within 50 miles simply vanished on February 5. From the perspective of those inside, they'll relive the same 3 days forever. And the terrible part, the truly horrifying part, is that after the first few iterations, you stop noticing. You accept it as reality. Only those who were deliberately shielded by temporal radiation countermeasures retain their memories across iterations." Dr. Vance was taking notes now, her stylus flying across her tablet. "How many iterations did you experience?" 47, Webb said. 47 times watching the same people make the same choices. 47 times trying to warn them. 47 times watching everyone forget. In iteration 32, I finally figured out what was happening. By iteration 40, I'd located the modified reactor. By iteration 45, I'd traced the modification to its source. His eyes opened, and they were filled with a despair that made Sarah's heart ache. It was me. I made the modification in iteration 3, trying to prevent a reactor accident that I thought would destroy the base. I created the very disaster I was trying to prevent.